Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on understanding costs and marginal revenue. Today, we'll be diving into some fundamental economic concepts, including average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost, and marginal cost. We'll also explore how these cost measures connect to marginal revenue and how they influence profit decisions. I'm excited to guide you through these essential ideas that play a crucial role in business and economic analysis. Let's get started. When businesses consider how much to produce, they focus closely on average cost, marginal cost, and marginal revenue. These economic concepts are critical because they help determine the optimal production level. Average cost tells us the cost per unit on average, while marginal cost shows the expense of producing one more unit. Marginal revenue reveals how much additional income that extra unit brings in. By comparing these factors, businesses can decide if producing one more item will actually boost their profit. This careful analysis ensures resources are used efficiently and helps avoid unnecessary losses. Understanding these ideas is fundamental to making smart production decisions. On this slide, we have a clear overview of the main cost measures that are essential in understanding production expenses. Starting with fixed costs, these are expenses that don't change no matter how much output we produce, and they serve as the base for calculating average fixed cost, which simply spreads these fixed costs over the number of units produced. Next, variable costs fluctuate with output, so the more you produce, the higher the total variable cost. And this forms the base for average variable cost, which again is the variable cost per unit produced. When we talk about average fixed cost and average variable cost, both are derived by dividing their respective total costs by the quantity produced, with average fixed cost decreasing as output increases because those fixed expenses are spread more thinly, while average variable cost changes depending on production levels. Total cost combines both fixed and variable costs, and its average, the average total cost, is just the sum of the average fixed and average variable costs. Lastly, marginal cost represents the additional cost of producing one extra unit. This measure is critical because it helps decide whether producing more units is economically beneficial. Understanding these relationships and how each measure connects is key to managing production costs efficiently. Here we see a line chart illustrating the relationship between average fixed cost and the quantity of units produced. As production increases from 1 to 10 units, you can observe a clear downward trend in the average fixed cost per unit. This happens because fixed expenses, like rent or salaries, are spread over more units, reducing the cost burden on each individual unit. For example, when only one unit is produced, the average fixed cost is quite high at $100, but by the time production reaches 10 units, that cost drops significantly to just $10 per unit. This concept is important because it highlights how increasing production can lower per unit costs, which is a key factor in achieving economies of scale and improving profitability. Here we see how the average variable cost changes as output levels increase. Starting at a high cost when output is low, the cost per unit decreases significantly as production ramps up, reaching its lowest point around output level 4 and 5. This decline reflects economies of scale, where spreading fixed costs and improving efficiency reduces expenses. However, after this minimum, costs begin to rise again, indicating diminishing returns. This upward trend might be due to factors like resource constraints or inefficiencies at higher production levels. Understanding this relationship is crucial because it helps businesses determine the most cost-effective output to achieve maximum efficiency. Here we have a line chart illustrating how the costs per unit change as the quantity of output increases. On the x-axis, we have the quantity of output, while the y-axis shows the cost per unit. The three lines represent average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost. Notice that the average fixed cost starts high, but steadily decreases as output increases. This happens because fixed costs are spread over more units. On the other hand, the average variable cost initially declines slightly, but then begins to rise as production expands. This reflects the increasing variable expenses per unit. The average total cost line is the sum of the fixed and variable costs at each output level. It follows a U-shaped curve, falling initially as fixed costs spread out, reaching a minimum point, and then rising as variable costs increase. This relationship is essential for understanding how businesses manage production costs to optimize efficiency and pricing strategies. Here we have a line graph illustrating the relationship between output quantity and marginal cost, which is essentially the cost of producing one additional unit of output. As you can see, the x-axis represents the output quantity starting from 0 up to 9 units, and the y-axis shows the marginal cost in dollars. Starting at just $2 for the very first unit, the marginal cost gradually increases as we produce more units, moving up to $12.50 by the time we reach 9 units. This upward trend indicates that each additional unit becomes more expensive to produce than the previous one. This is a common scenario in production due to diminishing returns, where resources become less efficient as output expands. Understanding this concept is crucial for making informed decisions about the optimal level of production to maximize profitability. Here we see the relationship between marginal cost, average variable cost, and average total cost as output quantity changes. The marginal cost curve initially declines, reaching its lowest point around quantity 5, and then starts to rise. This behavior reflects the law of diminishing returns. Notice how the marginal cost curve intersects the average variable cost and average total cost curves at their minimum points. This intersection is crucial because it signals the output level where producing one more unit begins to increase average costs. The average variable cost and average total cost curves move closely together, with the average total cost curve always lying above the average variable cost due to the inclusion of fixed costs. Understanding the interplay of these cost curves helps in making decisions about production levels to optimize cost efficiency. As quantity increases beyond the minimum points, costs per unit gradually rise, indicating less efficient production. This visual clearly shows the important roles these cost measures play in production planning. Here we're looking at how marginal revenue behaves under two different market structures: perfect competition and imperfect competition. Marginal revenue represents the additional income a firm gets from selling one more unit of output. Notice that in perfect competition, marginal revenue remains constant at 10, regardless of the quantity produced. This happens because firms are price takers. They sell as much as they want at the market price. On the other hand, in imperfect competition, marginal revenue decreases as output increases. This decline reflects the fact that to sell more units, the firm must lower its price, which reduces the revenue gained from each additional unit. So the key takeaway is that marginal revenue stays flat in perfect competition, but falls steadily under imperfect competition due to the pricing power firms have in those markets. Here we see the relationship between marginal revenue and marginal cost as we vary the quantity produced. The marginal revenue curve starts high and decreases steadily as quantity increases, reflecting how selling additional units brings in less revenue over time. On the other hand, marginal cost rises with each additional unit, indicating that producing more becomes increasingly expensive. The key point here is the profit-maximizing output, which occurs where these two curves intersect. At this point, the cost of producing one more unit exactly equals the revenue that unit generates. So beyond this quantity, producing more would reduce overall profit. Understanding this balance helps businesses make informed decisions about the optimal level of production to maximize their earnings. Here we have the two main choices a firm faces in the short run regarding production. On the left, if the price or marginal revenue covers the average variable cost, the firm will continue operating, even if it's not making an overall profit. This strategy helps minimize losses because the firm can cover some of its fixed costs through ongoing production. On the right, if revenue fails to cover the average variable cost, the firm will choose to shut down. Shutting down stops all variable costs, so losses are limited to the fixed costs only. Essentially, the firm decides based on whether continuing production helps reduce losses or simply increases them. This comparison highlights the critical point that covering variable costs is the threshold for continuing operations in the short run. Here we have a detailed table showing how costs and revenues change as output increases from 0 to 6 units. Starting with total cost, you can see it consists of fixed costs, which remain constant at $50 regardless of output, and variable costs that increase as more units are produced. For example, variable costs go from 0 at 0 output to $240 at 6 units. The average fixed cost per unit decreases as output rises because the fixed cost is spread over more units, from $50 per unit at 1 unit to just over $8 at 6 units. Meanwhile, the average variable cost initially stays constant at $30 per unit for the first 3 units, but begins to rise afterward, reflecting increasing costs for additional production. Looking at the average total cost, it decreases initially, reaching its lowest point around 4 units, and then starts to increase again due to rising variable costs. Marginal cost, which represents the cost of producing 1 more unit, starts at $30 and increases steadily to $60 by the 6th unit, indicating increasing difficulty or expense in producing additional units. Lastly, total revenue and marginal revenue maintain a consistent pattern. Total revenue increases by $100 per unit sold, and marginal revenue remains constant at $100. This signals that each additional unit sold adds the same amount to total revenue. Altogether, this table illustrates how costs and revenues interact as production scales, highlighting important concepts like economies of scale and marginal cost behavior. Here are some key takeaways to keep in mind. First, understanding cost behavior is crucial. Average fixed costs decrease as output rises, and average variable and total costs give us the cost per unit. Next, decision metrics like marginal cost and marginal revenue play a vital role. Marginal cost helps guide production choices, and marginal revenue tells us the income from selling 1 extra unit. Ultimately, profit is maximized when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. If you have any questions about these concepts or how they apply, feel free to ask.